Hello， 大家好，欢迎回到外媒看中国，我是安博然。US President Donald Trump has enacted a global tariff scheme that he claimed was reciprocal in nature, and he describes April 2nd, the day the worldwide tariffs were enacted, as America's Liberation Day. Well, he's right, but not for the reasons he thinks. Today's special guest, Professor Warwick Powell, argues that this is a chance for the world to accelerate its liberation from the US dollar-dominated trade settlements and finance system, and warns that instead of magically bringing manufacturing back to the US and creating thousands of new jobs, Trump's tariffs are instead a sort of self-inflicted harm. Is this the final nail in the coffin of American dollar hegemony? Today, we'll go beyond the propaganda. This is Reports on China. I'm Andy Boreham in Shanghai. Let's get reporting. Initially, President Trump wanted to enact his sweeping global tariffs on April 1, but decided to wait until the 2nd, just in case anyone thought it was an April Fool's joke. That's probably a bit of self-reflection that Trump should have taken to heart, because for many around the world, that's exactly what the tariffs are, a joke. In the build-up to April 2nd, Trump promoted them as reciprocal tariffs. Basically, he argued that the US was going to start taxing imports from certain countries at the same levels those countries tax the US. So if, for example, the US was buying steel from China that attracted a 20% tariff, the US too would add a 20% tariff going the other way. But that's not at all what ended up happening, with each of the 60-odd countries slapped with differing percentages based not on reciprocity, but trade deficits. Here to tell us more about it is Adjunct Professor Warwick Powell from the Queensland University of Technology, who's also a Senior Fellow at the Taihe Institute. Professor Powell, can you briefly talk us through how Trump's administration calculated these tariffs and why it is that countries like Vietnam, for example, ended up with a massive 46%?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting exercise in reverse engineering, because when there was talk about the calculations being based on this idea of reciprocity, one would have thought that the US administration would have undertaken a lot of detailed analysis on a country-by-country basis in terms of both tariff and non-tariff barriers that may or may not exist. Now, whether that is right or wrong is a different story, but if the idea of reciprocity is to anchor these sorts of calculations, and that's what you'd expect, but that's not actually what we got. What we got was actually an arbitrary methodology based on dividing the trade deficit or surplus that America has with a particular country with the amount of imports it gets from that country. And for good measure, the administration then halved whatever that number was and arrived at the tariff measure that it was going to impose. I get the sense that the halving was really a little bit of a real estate gimmick, because what it essentially was a way of saying, well, normally, under normal circumstances, we'd hit you with 92%, but because we're generous, we'll only hit you with 46%. So there's a little bit of marketing in all of this, but the point about this methodology, having been reverse engineered by plenty in social media and others, is to demonstrate that, in fact, the policy intent is not sincere to begin with, and it's focused solely on this question of deficits. But it's not just deficits either, because countries that actually don't have a surplus with the United States have also been levied with tariffs. Australia is an interesting case in point, because Australia actually experiences a trade deficit with the United States. In other words, Australia buys more from the United States than it sells. It also has zero tariffs on the United States, but the United States has levied a 10% tariff on Australian exports to the US. So it is clearly a case of targeting trade deficits as the foundation stones, as well as a little bit of capriciousness and arbitrariness as far as determining particular numbers are concerned. And that, unfortunately, has made the entire exercise something of a joke.
Yeah, and you mentioned the calculation was actually reverse engineered by people on social media, which I found quite funny. You mentioned in a recent article that this is perhaps a great opportunity for countries around the world, and particularly the global south, to liberate themselves from US hegemony and take these arbitrary Trump tariffs as kind of the straw that broke the camel's back. So in your opinion, what should countries in the global south do now?
Look, the first thing to do is to recognise that any change in the relative pricing, which is what tariffs are, will have an impact, which means that countries and companies in those countries will need to make adjustments. The principal ways in which countries and companies can make adjustments will be to identify new market opportunities and intensify their cross-border trade collaborations with others who continue to recognise the mutual benefits of trade, particularly in a multilateral environment. What that will mean will be that countries will firstly look to any fiscal policy responses that their governments may undertake to compensate for the potential loss of demand from the United States, but also work with other countries to align their trade policies, to streamline their arrangements, reduce paperwork, cut red tape, and ultimately make the processes of trade a lot smoother and less costly so that the countries and the companies can continue to benefit from the exchange of goods and services. They're the sorts of things that we're starting to see already. So we have seen that China, Japan, and the Republic of Korea, for instance, have met and have agreed that they need to move forward quite hard to consolidate their trilateral trading relationships. And they're not the only ones. So there are many countries in the world now who are reaching out to others, focused squarely on ensuring that the multilateral and the bilateral trading arrangements that are in place can be consolidated and expanded.
So do you think, I mean, in a way, I guess you're saying decouple from the United States. Do you think that would be hard for countries in the global south? And how long do you think that would take?
Look, in some ways, of course, the United States is decoupling from the rest of the world. But there are, of course, transitional pains, if you will, and there, let's not make two bones about it. Any major structural change that takes time and that involves changing the ways that you go about doing things, particularly when you've fine-tuned what you do over a period of time, is going to require effort and it's going to be disruptive. So this isn't a click your fingers and everything will be okay in one moment kind of thing. But there is no doubt that the companies and the countries of the global south have, over the last 10 to 15 years, and for some even more, been expanding their trade relationships with each other. So much so that, in fact, the United States market represents no more than about 14.5 to 15% of global imports. That's halved over the last 20 odd years. The United States market is simply not as important as it once was. So global south countries have already been making this adjustment. Now, going forward, the extent to which and the time it's going to take different countries and different companies to make further adjustments will, of course, depend upon the structures of their economies, as well as the extent to which they currently trade with the United States. There have been various studies done over the course of the last few weeks, and I've done some of my own estimates, and that suggests that most global south countries can fully compensate for the loss of the United States market by pursuing further opening up of trade, by pursuing fiscal coordination, and of course, just by benefiting from the organic growth in global trade anyway. And that can accomplish a transition from between 2 to 4 years, depending on which country we're talking about. So it's not going to be a quick transformation in the sense that it's not social media quick, but it is something that in the scheme of the grander sweep of history is not going to be an unreasonably lengthy period of time.
In your article, you argue that these type of tariffs kind of really hurt the country, leveling them more than anyone else. So I was wondering, what are the precedents that these tariffs will mainly hurt the US?
Look, the most recent precedent, if you will, is actually Trump 1.0 and the continuation of the policies under the Biden administration. The Trump 1.0 tariffs, which came into effect in 2018, unsurprisingly caused a number of scholars to undertake studies on the impact on the North American market and whether or not the tariffs were passed through and what impact these tariffs had on the rejuvenation of industry and employment. The studies tend to show that by and large, and again it varies from industry to industry, but by and large the tariffs were passed on through to some extent to end consumers. And when they weren't, the tariffs ultimately affected the companies that were doing the importing themselves. So the importers absorbed the cost of the tariffs, and that, of course, affected their profit margins and their employment. In terms of the downstream industries affected, the studies suggest that the net impact of the tariffs, both in terms of the first industries affected and subsequently their customers, was a negative impact on employment. So whilst the directly protected industry may have saved some jobs or added some extra jobs, the additional costs that caused to be pushed on through the system to the downstream users of that particular industry's products meant that there were more job losses downstream than job gains upstream. So the net welfare outcome for the American labour market was negative.
It seems to me, as someone outside of the US, that Washington, D.C. is increasingly tone deaf about its position and its power in the world in 2025. It seems obvious, for example, that the US, and not just Trump's administration, by the way, seem to be doing everything they can to push the world, and especially the global South, away from working with the US on anything. Why is it that Washington, D.C. just keeps driving toward the edge of the cliff at increasing speed?
Look, there's a long and deep cultural dimension towards the way that the American policy elite, those inside the Beltway, have viewed America and viewed America's relationship with the rest of the world. It's actually pretty hard to come down from the tree that sees you at the top of it as the exceptionalist one. But unfortunately, from America's point of view, the world has evolved from the time when America could claim to be the sole unipolar hegemon. Today, in 2025, the world is far more multipolar than it has been for many, many decades, and America has not yet adjusted to that. It's going to need to adjust to that reality so that it can better navigate that reality in the interests of its own citizens. Right now, however, the more belligerent the Americans get, the more ad hoc and capricious the Americans get in relation to their policy settings and how they deal with the rest of the world, the more harm they do to themselves, and the more likely they are to push away everyone else, who, of course, will simply get on with life. Nobody is going to wait for the United States. Certainly no one is going to give the United States a free lunch. There is always a seat at the table for the United States at the multipolar table when America is good and ready to join as a normal and equal partner.
Might be a big ask. Professor Warwick Powell, thank you so much for sharing your insights today.
Absolute pleasure.
And on that note, that will be it for today, you guys. But as always, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Is the US just biting off its nose to spite its face? And will these latest Trump tariffs backfire spectacularly? Let me know down below, and don't forget to hit like and subscribe if you haven't already. It really does help the channel. I'll see you all next time. Bye-bye.